Oh, okay.
Rabbi, I used to have the poster the Moreau poster you have in the background.
Oh,
We have one of those.
oh, that's good.
Yeah.
I think I stole it from my parents. So that's what we did. I like it.
Yeah.
All right. Well, why don't we just start? I'm sure oh, here we go. Okay. A couple of people will come in as we go. Yeah, let's just give it 1 or 2 more minutes then. I don't want to. Everyone able to get outside a little bit? Enjoy the day? It's amazing.
Unbelievable, isn't it?
Yeah, it's so nice.
I think tomorrow it ends though.
Uh,
Rain anyway.
all right. So let's start. Today, our subject is Felix Frankfurter. Probably, aside from Brandeis, well, one could argue Ruth Bader Ginsburg too, but Frankfurter is certainly among the most prolific, influential, important, one could say from a historical perspective, Supreme Court justices. But his life he's also very enigmatic. And we're going to look at that today. We're going to kind of see he's not predictable, and he has some extraordinary qualities that, you know, we would admire and say, what a remarkable person. And then he has some things that we say, wow, I didn't realize that. And I disagree vociferously with him on that. So he's sort of a, I guess complex is the best way to say it. Brandeis was brilliant, but he's not as complex emotionally and intellectually, I think, as Frankfurter is. So let's start with the beginning. So Felix Frankfurter arrives in America at age 12. He speaking no English, zero. He is an immigrant in the Lower East Side, and he comes with his parents, and his dad is sort of a merchant. His dad was sort of the not so bright brother. They were from Vienna, so these were, I mean, they were Viennese Jews, which was sort of a kind of elite group, but they were sort of middle class, lower middle class Viennese Jews. These weren't like the Theodor Herzl, who came from a sort of upper class. They were sort of urban Jews who came from Vienna, and Felix Frankfurter's father was sort of the not so bright brother, and he had another brother, Simon Frankfurter, who was brilliant and who ended up becoming a very important Jewish scholar, and we'll get to him in a little bit. But this is also an important historical fact. The people who immigrated to America tended to be the more risk-taking, not the people who were conventional. The people who immigrated were often the people who were sort of not comfortable in the existing society, and that represented Felix Frankfurter's father. He was not comfortable in the existing society, and he came, and he worked as a merchant, sort of a door-to-door salesman. Not poor, but certainly not rich, not middle class even. But Felix Frankfurter came, and he thrived academically. And what he did was he would go to the public library. He essentially lived in the public library. According to his biographers, I mean, he was there every day. He would review periodicals. He was a voracious reader, and he was extremely academically gifted. And that was how he learned. He learned English that way, and he was able to go to City College of New York, which was sort of considered the Harvard of the Jews, because it was free. It was a free school, and it was a lot of really smart kids who didn't go to the Ivy League schools, which, had quotas often, and were not accessible. And so he went to City College of New York, and he thrived there. This is what he, Frankfurter's real education came from the public libraries and downtown institutions to which many an immigrant owed his education. And in City College, he was editor of the newspaper. He was respected as a speaker, and he graduated third in his class of 775. And his class at City College was 75% Jewish. So this was an environment. He grew up Orthodox. Now this is very important. He grew up Orthodox, but while he was at City College, he left Judaism. I mean, he didn't convert to another religion, but according to his biographers, he went to a Yom Kippur service in his junior year, said, "This doesn't mean anything to me," walked out and never went back into synagogue. It's interesting. It's interesting. So he, and then after he graduated, he went to Harvard Law School, and he excelled there. But very interestingly, one of the things that sort of is an enigma, I guess partially an enigma, is, as I said, he really wasn't interested at all in Judaism, but he was very interested in being accepted by the Boston Brahmin elite, the aristocracy. So his closest friends at Harvard Law School were, people with last names like Cabot and Root and Holmes, Oliver Wendell. He admired Oliver Wendell Holmes. So he was in some ways trying to escape his Judaism to a degree. Different than Brandeis. Brandeis never really, I don't mean it in this, Brandeis never really was Jewish in a traditional sense. Brandeis grew up totally assimilated, whereas Frankfurter grew up Orthodox, but then deeply wanted to assimilate. So in some ways they had opposite journeys. But at Harvard, again, Frankfurter excelled enormously, and he became very close to one of his classmates, who named Henry Stimson, who came from a long prestigious family, who eventually became war secretary. So essentially, Frankfurter kind of became part of the establishment through his time at Harvard Law School. And Frankfurter, from all the reports about him, was extremely charming, extremely well-spoken, bright, funny, interesting, a person you would enjoy being around. He wasn't, even with all his brilliance, he wasn't an academic snob. He was quite a wonderful person to be around. And he endeared himself to the right people. And then when he graduated, at that time, there were Jewish law firms and there were Gentile law firms. That was true in Chicago too, by the way. It's true in all major cities. And the very top law firms generally did not hire any Jews. And so the really bright Jewish students would go to the Jewish law firms, who were excellent too, but they, kind of like it was the same thing in investment banking. Goldman Sachs was a Jewish investment bank. Morgan Stanley was a Gentile. Now that's, it kind of is not the same anymore. But Frankfurter only applied to Gentile law firms. He refused to apply to any Jewish law firms, and he was rejected by all of them. Then he went to work for the U.S. Attorney's Office, which was a very prestigious position, U.S. Attorney in New York. He was there for 2 years. Then he was hired by one of the Gentile law firms, the first Jewish person they had ever hired. And he was there for a couple of years, but he had gotten very interested in public service through his time in the U.S. Attorney's Office. And it was also in his time in the U.S. Attorney's Office that he met Franklin Delano Roosevelt. But most importantly was his friendship with Henry Stimson and that circle. So eventually, in 1911, Frankfurter moved to New York. Moved from New York to Washington, D.C. And that he was working in the government. He was with Henry Stimson, his friend, and he was part of a group of young people who were involved in the U.S. Attorney's Office, involved in the War Department, just kind of doing public service. And that is when Frankfurter made a lot of contacts that would be very useful to him in the future. First and foremost among them was Louis Brandeis. So Brandeis was frequently in Washington arguing cases before the Supreme Court and involved in the Zionist movement. And Brandeis and Frankfurter hit it off. And even though Frankfurter had essentially abandoned his Judaism, he had sympathy for the Zionist movement, basically because Brandeis urged him to be. So Brandeis and Frankfurter developed a really wonderful relationship. In fact, Frankfurter wrote in his diary after he had lunch with Frankfurter wrote in his diary in 1911 after he had lunch with Brandeis. Brandeis has depth and an intellectual sweep that are tonical. He has great force. Brandeis is a very big man, one of the most penetrating minds I know. I should like to see him Attorney General of the United States. Okay, ultimately became a Supreme Court justice. But so Frankfurter's living and working in Washington, D.C., and he gets married. Now, as you might be able to guess, his wife is not Jewish. His wife is from a very prominent Connecticut family, although not like rich, just, it's just sort of a long-standing Connecticut family. And Frankfurter's mother does not attend the wedding. They still had a relationship. Frankfurter's mother had a relationship, but she, his father had died, and his mother did not attend the wedding. Although I think they reconciled eventually. As I said, they had a relationship. But Frankfurter, her name was Marion Denman, and they stayed married their whole lives. She had two nervous breakdowns, so she was not. It was a big job for him to sort of take care of her, but he did, and. They were married, not by a rabbi, of course. They were married by Justice Cardozo, who we talked about last week. So Frankfurter was, even at this young age, was part of this very elite circle of lawyers and judges, because he was universally respected. His wife's father was a Protestant minister, which is kind of interesting. But anyways, he's in Washington, D.C., he's working. Then a group of guys, mainly Brandeis and a few others, want Harvard Law School to hire Frankfurter. So these guys go around and they actually raise money from wealthy Jews to have Harvard hire Frankfurter. Turned out, somebody retired at Harvard Law School. They hired Frankfurter to succeed him, and Frankfurter became a professor at Harvard Law School. And he was an excellent teacher. And he began supplying law clerks to Brandeis and other justices. He was a successful law professor. But then, when the United States entered World War I, he went back to Washington. He was called to help with the War Department, and that's where he became even closer with Franklin Delano Roosevelt, because Roosevelt was Assistant Navy Secretary, which was a big job. And Frankfurter became a very close advisor to Roosevelt. So with this, Roosevelt's not our topic, but one of the interesting things about Franklin Delano Roosevelt is he cultivated a very close, smart group of advisors who advised him politically, policy-wise, and so forth. Frankfurter was among the closest of those. He advised them on everything. Here's what FDR said about Frankfurter. His command of labor, statistics, administrative finesse, and charm greatly impressed me. And they would frequently have lunch together at FDR's house. Eleanor Roosevelt, though, I know she's lauded as a great hero and a wonderful person, but at least at this point in her life, she was an anti-Semite. She referred to him as an interesting little man, but very Jew. So Eleanor Roosevelt was not a big fan of Frankfurter. She wasn't a fan of Jews in general at that time. Later on, she opened up, but anyways, so he's working in Washington. He's close with FDR. And in Washington, he continues to cultivate his relationships with Brandeis, with others. And in fact, because of his relationship with Brandeis and the American Zionist movement, Frankfurter was one of the delegates to the Versailles Peace Conference in 1919 as an advisor, a legal advisor to the Zionist delegation. So Frankfurter was one of these guys who had a lot of energy, and he's kind of involved in everything. And so he's in Versailles for the Great Versailles Treaty, and he's working with the Zionist group, which is, of course, negotiating with the British, which is negotiating with the Arabs. And in fact, Frankfurter had a very famous meeting with a major Arab leader named, what's his name? It was Emir Faisal ibn Hussein, who would briefly become king of Syria and then Iraq. And in that meeting, they created a communique in which King Faisal expressed his support for the Zionist movement. This was not, there were other major Arab leaders at the time who supported Zionism. This, we now think of the Arabs and the Israelis as, constantly at odds. That was not the case always. There were Arab leaders who believed that it would be good for the Middle East. So Frankfurter, in fact, here's the communique in his historic letter to Frankfurter, dated March 31st, 1919, King Faisal endorsed the Balfour Declaration. Here's what he wrote. We Arabs, especially the educated among us, it's a little elitist, but look with the deepest sympathy on the Zionist movement. Our deputation here in Paris is fully acquainted with the proposals submitted by the Zionist organization to the peace conference, and we regard them as moderate and proper. We will do our best insofar as we are concerned to help them through. We will wish the Jews a most hearty welcome home. Can you believe that? That's kind of hard to believe in today's age, but that was that. Anyways, peace conference ends. Frankfurter sort of attained some prominence through this exchange. But then, as I talked about with Brandeis, Brandeis's whole group in the Zionist movement are essentially kicked out by Chaim Weizmann, because Chaim Weizmann thinks they're too assimilationist. So in 1920, Chaim Weizmann bans any of Brandeis and his supporters from the movement. So Frankfurter goes back to teaching at Harvard Law School. The 1920s were a very interesting period for Frankfurter. He gets involved in a lot of civil liberties work. He's one of the founders of the ACLU. He's one of the founders of the NAACP. His most famous case was two Italian anarchists named Sacco and Vanzetti, who were accused of trying to blow up a building, I believe, and Frankfurter represented them, or he didn't represent them. Yeah, in April 1920, the two Italian immigrant anarchists were accused of stealing $15,000 from a shoe company in the Boston suburb of South Braintree and killing the company's paymaster and guard. And there was a lot of evidence against them. Turns out, I think most people believe they were guilty now, but in any case, kind of like the Rosenbergs. Most people believe they were guilty, actually. So anyways, that's a different topic. But he joined the defense because he believed that the police had coerced certain witnesses into testifying a certain way, which makes sense. It could have happened. And so not only does he work as part of the defense team, he writes a lot of popular articles about the case. Kind of like, you might say, similar to what Alan Dershowitz has done throughout his career. He's both a lawyer working, but he's also writing popular articles. And he wrote a book called The Case of Sacco and Vanzetti, which was a bestseller. So Frankfurter attained some national prominence. through his work here. And he also speaks out against, the president of Harvard, Lawrence Lowell. This is when he implemented in 1910, in 1922, the Jewish student population at Harvard was 21%. Lawrence Lowell, that's a lot. Lawrence Lowell said it should only be 10%. And he starts implementing, he essentially creates a quota for Jewish students. And Frankfurter speaks out strongly against it. But ultimately, Lowell wins. And by 1928, Harvard's official Jewish enrollment had fallen to precisely 10%. So within 7 years, it goes from 28% to 10%. That's clearly anti-Semitism, and Frankfurter spoke out against it. By the way, that's an issue before the Supreme Court right now. Different context, different issues, but interesting. That'd be a good thing to have a constitutional lawyer talk about sometimes. But in any case, Frankfurter is sort of a very prominent public intellectual lawyer, respected. When FDR runs for governor in 1928, Frankfurter becomes his closest political advisor. So this relationship with Roosevelt was probably the most important relationship in Frankfurter's life. And he works closely with Roosevelt and is trusted implicitly, and they speak all the time. Roosevelt, he wins, and then he runs for president. And when he runs for president, again, Frankfurter is among his closest advisors. But then, interestingly, FDR does not appoint Roosevelt to his cabinet. There is talk that Roosevelt wanted to appoint Frankfurter, but Frankfurter didn't want to. Who knows? But what Frankfurter does, and this is very, very important, many of Frankfurter's students go to work for FDR in government. Let's see here. So many: Samuel Roseman, Harold Ickes, Francis Perkins, Harry Hopkins, Henry Morgan. All these folks were taught and influenced by Frankfurter. And even though he's not an official part of the Roosevelt administration, there are people who say Frankfurter is the most important figure in the Roosevelt administration. And so he exerts great influence. He's progressive, and he's sort of a big deal. So then what happens? He continues to teach. Brandeis and he continue to correspond. He continues to provide clerks for Supreme Court. But then a few things happen. First, we've got the rise of Hitler in Germany, and that begins to consume a lot of Frankfurter's efforts. But in an interesting way, Frankfurter never really, this goes to the enigma. Despite his wonderful relationship with Roosevelt, Frankfurter never pressured Roosevelt to admit more immigrants, when his own uncle, so his father's older brother, the one who was, the really bright one, who had become essentially a professor of Jewish studies in Vienna and the de facto leader of the Jewish community, is imprisoned by the Nazis after the Nazis invaded Austria. Roosevelt doesn't interfere. Roosevelt doesn't talk to, Frankfurter doesn't talk to Roosevelt about this. Frankfurter ultimately found other ways to help out his uncle. but he never used his influence for Roosevelt to help his family. He used his influence to get a lot of his friends appointed to jobs. Interesting dilemma. But in any case, when Cardozo dies in 1939, there's immense pressure on Roosevelt to appoint Frankfurter. First of all, this has kind of become the Jewish seat. And also, Frankfurter is seen as the best pick. Frankfurter is not above lobbying for the position himself. He does. He tells Roosevelt he would love the job. Roosevelt initially doesn't want to because there would be 2 Jews on the Supreme Court. Because Brandeis is on there. But Roosevelt ultimately does, and Frankfurter joins the Supreme Court on January 30th, 1939. Now, interestingly, unlike Brandeis, Frankfurter's confirmation was not nearly as controversial as Brandeis's. Now, that's kind of interesting. First of all, maybe there's less anti-Semitism, but actually really not, because the 1930s were among the most anti-Semitic periods in American history. But essentially, Frankfurter is not seen as radical as Brandeis was. Brandeis was seen as a political radical. Frankfurter is not, even though Frankfurter is, at this time, has been politically radical or quite progressive, you could say. So there was very few opponents of Frankfurter's appointment, but there were a few. And the ones who did said, people already think the Jews control Roosevelt. Instead of the New Deal, it's called the Jew Deal. That was a common anti-Semitic creed. Father Coughlin would say that, it's not the New Deal, it's the Jew Deal. And, Henry Morgenthau was Roosevelt's Treasury Secretary. Now, here's something really interesting that I did not know before I was preparing for this class. Do you know who the biggest opponents of Frankfurter's appointment were? Jews. It was the elite. The New York Times publisher, Sulzberger, opposed the nomination of Frankfurter. Henry Morgenthau, who had been friendly with Frankfurter and was one of his students, opposed the nomination. So here's what they said. Here's what they were worried about anti-Semitism. Prior to his announcement, Roosevelt had asked Henry Morgenthau Jr., his Treasury Secretary and closest friend and advisor in his cabinet, whether he should choose Frankfurter or James Landis, who was the Harvard Law School dean. Morgenthau advised picking Landis. Frankfurter, perhaps jealous of Morgenthau's closeness with Roosevelt, dismissed Morgenthau as a stupid bootlick who did not deserve his high post. Other prominent Jews, however, shared this concern, led by Arthur Hayes Sulzberger, the New York Times publisher, who organized what Benjamin Cohn called the, quote, Jewish protest against Felix's appointment, and met with Roosevelt at the White House specifically to argue against the appointment. This faction of the anti-Frankfurter camp held that he should neither accept nor be given the appointment because this would only intensify charges that Roosevelt's New Deal was actually the Jew Deal, and that as Nazi propaganda would have it, Jews were seeking to control the world by dominating FDR's administration. So interestingly, you see, sometimes things don't change all that much. We have, there's a lot of internal battles in the Jewish community today, but it's quite interesting. I mean, that some of his most prominent opponents were fellow Jews. However, over time, Frankfurter's representative to the Judiciary Committee was Dean Acheson, who ultimately became Secretary of State. but who was also a former student and a law clerk for Brandeis. And Atchison represented Frankfurter. And by the end of it, Frankfurter was unanimously confirmed to the court. So he enters the Supreme Court, and you would expect, this is part of the enigma of Frankfurter. You would expect that once you're on the Supreme Court, you're not really supposed to be involved in politics anymore, especially in official capacity. But Frankfurter continued to be a very close advisor to FDR while he was on the court. He would meet with FDR. He would help draft legislation. He would meet with congressmen and representatives. He would encourage certain judicial appointments and not, I mean, it was quite, from our perspective today, quite unethical, but he did. That was part of his, I guess, his way of being. And so did Brandeis, by the way, but Frankfurter even much more. He was on the court, and this also speaks to the sort of the enigmatic quality of Frankfurter. You would think that given his history, given his activism in the past, he would have been a sort of traditional liberal Supreme Court justice, kind of like Brandeis and Oliver Wendell Holmes. Turned out he wasn't at all. A couple of his interesting decisions. The first is a case called, let's see, where is this? I want to get the name right. Minersville School District versus Gobitis. And this was a public school, the Minersville School District in, I believe, Pennsylvania. And this is in 1940, so his second year on the court. They expelled 2 Jehovah's Witness students from the school because they would not salute the American flag. Interesting. So the Minersville School District said that all students have to recite the Pledge of Allegiance, and these 2 Jehovah's Witness students, a 12-year-old and a 10-year-old, were expelled from the school, and they said that they could not do so, as Jehovah's Witnesses today don't, because it's bowing to a graven image. And the Supreme Court ruled 8-1 in favor of the school district. And many of Frankfurter's former associates were on the side of the Jehovah's Witnesses, the kids, who said, you know, this is a religious liberty. The children were entitled, if on their religious beliefs, they did not believe this was this was a violation of their religious expression, and they shouldn't have to. However, Frankfurter believed in this philosophy, and we hear it a lot today, of judicial restraint. If the school district made the decision that that everyone had to salute the flag, then then the Supreme Court should respect that decision. So in many ways, Frankfurter had a conservative sort of philosophy in that regard, that judicial restraint, that judges should be very careful about overturning laws passed by local districts. It's very interesting. One of his critics, as Justice Frankfurter became an increasingly articulate and persuasive advocate of judicial abnegation and restraint, he showed such dedication to the principle that the liberal Yale Law School professor, Fred Rodell, referred to him sarcastically as the Supreme Court's Emily Post. Interestingly. There was another case at the time called West Virginia West Virginia Board of Education versus Barnett, in which case there was another case where Seventh-day Baptists were not saluting the flag. No, this was a case of Sunday laws, of Sunday blue laws, where stores were closed on Sunday because that was the sort of, I mean, there's still towns where that was the case. And again, Frankfurter ruled in favor of allowing towns to close stores, mandatory store closures on Sunday. And by the way, that hurt Orthodox Jews a lot. The people that were the biggest opponents of the blue laws were Jewish communities. And yet Frankfurter sided with that, saying, this is the law, we have to respect it. Now, a lot of people question, why did Frankfurter, what was it that caused him to, be comfortable with mandatory saluting of the flag, to be comfortable with blue laws? And a lot of the analysis suggests there's a psychological element to it. Frankfurter was very patriotic, very patriotic. They said when he would walk through the Supreme Court, he would whistle Stars and Stripes Forever. And he asked, when he was, before he died, he told his biographer to tell readers how much I love my country. So he was, I guess he was sort of felt a deep love of America, which was not uncommon among immigrants, especially first generation immigrants. So perhaps his sort of deep patriotism shaped his decisions. Also with the blue laws, it might have been his sense that this is part of American tradition, and I'm not going to violate that American tradition. So he was a surprising Supreme Court justice in that way. Somebody who came on perceived as a great liberal, but became more conservative. However, on the opposite side, where we might say his great success, his great vision, was in Brown versus Board of Education. Now, Earl Warren is typically given the great credit because he was the Chief Justice for Brown versus Board of Education, and it was a monumental decision, obviously ending legal segregation in Southern schools. But the person most responsible for putting together a unanimous opinion was Frankfurter. Frankfurter, behind the scenes, worked tremendously to create create a universal decision. And the way he did so was he already, see, from a legal perspective, if you believe in judicial restraint, you would not support overturning segregation laws, because these are the laws. If the local government and the state government allow there to be segregation, and you believe that the judiciary should defer to policymakers, then you wouldn't overturn them. However, Frankfurter said, when the judiciary is unanimous in saying that a law is unconstitutional, then judicial activism is warranted. So he believed that the only way you should really overturn popularly passed laws is through judicial consensus. This underlined his belief in the need for court unanimity on Brown and explained the tenacity of his campaign to achieve it. That was his vision. And he worked with Justice Warren in writing the opinion in Brown, and he considered it one of his finest moments. He had always been opposed to segregation, for all his sort of conservatism in some areas. He was a founder of the NAACP. He hired this I did not know until researching this. He hired the Supreme Court's first Black law clerk in 1948, which was a major distinction. However, again, getting to the enigma of Frankfurter, he hired the court's first Black law clerk. But do you know who applied to be his clerk, I believe in 1960, and was turned down? Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She applied to be his Supreme Court clerk, and he said he was not ready to hire a woman. Even though her professor, who was his friend, lobbied him to hire her, said she's an extraordinary student, he did not. So, well, again, enigmatic, very interesting, very forward-looking in some ways and backward-looking in other ways. He had another Supreme Court decision which was enigmatic, and this is a relatively famous Supreme Court case called Schneiderman versus the United States, when in 1939, William Schneiderman, a Jewish immigrant from Russia and naturalized American citizen, had been a Communist Party member since his youth. And in 1932, he ran for governor of Minnesota on the communist ticket. In 1939, the government moved to strip Schneiderman, then 35, of his citizenship because he belonged to the Communist Party, and arguing that his communist activities in the 5 years prior to the naturalization process showed that he had not been truly attached to the principles of the US Constitution. The Schneiderman case made it to the Supreme Court. And who wrote the majority opinion for the supporting the decision to strip Schneiderman of his citizenship? But Felix Frankfurter. For the Jewish immigrant, Schneiderman was, quote, this is Frankfurter writing, a fundamentally disloyal immigrant, one who subscribed fully to the beliefs of the Communist Party and took the oath of naturalization in bad faith in the hopes of undermining the country that had welcomed him to its shores, a dangerous traitor whose citizenship should be revoked. Woo. Interesting. This is from a previous major champion of civil liberties. Now, again, a psychological explanation, and this is what one of his biographers write, is that the Schneiderman case brought to the fore Frankfurter's deep love of the Constitution. He spoke of his own naturalization as a conversion. Loyalty to the Constitution, Frankfurter wrote, or this is his biographer writing, was his religion. And it is well known that a convert is more zealous than one born to the faith. So in other words, an immigrant who becomes an American is more zealously patriotic than someone born in America, interestingly. His faith was a, quote, constitutional faith that has effectively replaced Judaism for Frankfurter. And this is Frankfurter writing. As one who has no ties with any formal religion, perhaps the feelings that underlie religious forms for me run into intensifications of my feelings about American citizenship. Isn't that interesting? So he had, in a sense, Americanism, patriotism, replaced his Judaism. Who knows how, we're psychoanalyzing somebody who's been dead 50 years, 60 years, and we don't know, but it is an interesting, that was not uncommon. Jewish immigrants of that generation were extremely patriotic. So Frankfurter has this major decision. And then he has another really conservative decision. Where is this? Another. And this actually has great relevance today. In 1962, there was a case about voting rights, Baker versus Carr. A Tennessee county, this Tennessee state legislature essentially gerrymandered the districts in Tennessee so that the rural districts, which were predominantly segregationist and racist, had way more representation than the urban districts. And the case was brought up to the Supreme Court, and the plaintiff said the Supreme Court needs to ensure that there's fair representation. The way the Tennessee state government has gerrymandered our district does not mean that there's equal representation, because certain districts with majority white populations have greater influence. Now, the Supreme Court ultimately overturned Tennessee's law. This is why there are, this, in a sense, the just decision from perhaps many of our perspectives was made. But Frankfurter dissented. For Frankfurter, Baker versus Carr provided the perfect and indeed crowning example of where judicial restraint was appropriate. It was not only that legislatures had always been in charge of redistricting, but rather that the act of designing districts was the most inherently political act possible. By involving the court in the redistricting process and thus permitting it to enter what he called the political thicket, the very legitimacy of the court would be undermined, according to Frankfurter. There is not, here's what he wrote, there is not under our Constitution a judicial remedy for every political mischief. In a democratic society like ours, relief must come through an aroused popular conscience that sears the conscience of the people's representatives. The Supreme Court did not have the right, in his view, to get involved in political questions such as how state governments should apportion their legislatures. These were questions to be decided by the state's elected political representatives. Frankfurter's dissent in Baker versus Carr helped consolidate his reputation as a judicial conservative. The dissent was also the last opinion he wrote, because after that decision, 1962, he had a major stroke, which ultimately led to his resignation. But I'm going to pause here because there's a lot we just discussed. I mean, the question about voting apportionment, I mean, this has been before the Supreme Court many times and is still, I mean, an issue of contention. This in the state of Texas. So what Frankfurter was essentially arguing is that he may agree that what the Tennessee legislature did was utterly outrageous. However, he does not believe it is the Supreme Court's task to fix bad public policy. The Supreme Court, in rare instances, can overturn absolutely clearly unconstitutional policy like segregation. However, the Supreme Court, and they should only do that when it's unanimous. However, a bad political map passed by a democratically elected legislature, even if one disagrees with it, does not warrant Supreme Court involvement. What do you think about this? What do you think about Frankfurter? As I said, he's enigmatic. Yeah, Todd.
So it's interesting. I mean, obviously, Frankfurter is taking a very narrow position on political issues, which I think a number of people have. That the judiciary has to stay out of political issues. But if you talk about segregation, that is ultimately, certainly by consequence, a political issue. So he's obviously carved an exception out for that for whatever reason. Luckily, he did so. But and again, I haven't followed the whole debate since then, but I would assume that a number of decisions since then have basically noted the overlap between gerrymandered districts, which are designed to eliminate, to literally segregate people, segregate the vote. And I'm sure a number of other commentators have basically said that there is an overlap between political issues and segregation issues.
Well, yes. I mean, that is sort of from if you were to look at it in a strict way, he should have dissented in the Brown decision if he truly was a judicial restraint maximalist, that if the southern states had decided, the legislatures had decided there should be segregation, then we should support that. I think he could probably make the argument that they're not truly democratically elected legislatures, since blacks really couldn't vote and so forth. So you could make the argument that it wasn't a truly public policy decision. But from a strictly, you want to take a very strict philosophy, yeah, he should have, he should not have. But Frankfurter was also a political animal, and he probably saw which way the wind was blowing, and whether I think he was probably a very strong believer in equal rights, and he knew that was the future, and so he made an exception in this case. Yeah, who's next? Neil, go ahead.
I'm not a lawyer, but, you know, one of the cases that you cited that the people will resolve the gerrymandering by voting out the gerrymanderers just seems to be obviously self-contradictory, because gerrymandering is to preserve the people in power. And if you do it correctly, the majority will never have a chance to resolve this. Again, I'm not a lawyer, but it just seems to me that the contradiction is so obvious here. He strikes me as Brett Kavanaugh. Yeah, that he's like a guy of his time that just wanted to get along. But I don't
Yeah,
know.
it's really interesting. He's a very, I keep using this word, enigmatic, and it's true. What his biographers say about him, and I know a couple people like this, you probably do too. These are people that are really nice to people that don't like them, that are rude to them, and then kind of abrasive and rude to their friends. You know, people like that. I'm oversimplifying, but Frankfurter would flatter people who really didn't like him, like Henry Morgenthau and so forth and others. But then he was sort of abrasive with others who sort of shared his feelings. This is apropos of nothing, but this reminded me. I heard a story about a rabbi who what was in Israel, and a synagogue trip, or was it? It was a synagogue trip. Saw him in Israel, and this was from his synagogue. I think he was on sabbatical or something, and he was there in this synagogue trip, and then the rabbi barely spoke to the people from his synagogue, but there was somebody from a different synagogue who was there on the trip, and the rabbi spent all his time sort of charming this guy from another synagogue. So it's sort of an oversimplification, but sometimes we're nice to people that are not so nice to us, and then not so nice to the people who are kind to us. It's sort of a paradox, but people say Frankfurter was kind of like that. So there is something unusual. Maybe he didn't really feel, that's partly the immigrant experience, that even though he had been accepted within these high echelons, he never really felt at home. That's common immigrant experience. Yeah, go ahead, Brenda. Unmute.
How did he get along with Cardoza?
They were very friendly, but Cardoza had died,
Yeah.
when Frankfurter came up, but they were very close. I mean, Cardoza officiated at his wedding. So,
Which was a little surprising to me at the time, because Cardoza wasn't religious, so I guess
he wasn't really religious. None of the Supreme Court justices who are Jewish have been very religious. Not interesting. I think the closest is Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She belonged to a synagogue. I don't know if she attended, but she belonged to the conservative synagogue in DC. Certainly Stephen Breyer was not, even though he grew up. Ilana Kagan was not. I wonder if Ilana Kagan went to KAM, because she was the dean, I believe, at University of Chicago for a period of time, but she certainly doesn't, so. But Frankfurter, I didn't get to this part actually, but Frankfurter insisted on the Kaddish being read at his funeral.
Oh.
And Frankfurter also hired the Supreme Court's first Orthodox Jewish law clerk.
Interesting.
Now there are a few, interestingly, and this law clerk, he might have hired him because he didn't know the clerk was Orthodox, because he didn't wear a yarmulke at the Supreme Court. And even though he would in stealth sleep at the Supreme Court on Friday night, because Saturday was the meeting between the clerks and the justices. And he was also very careful not to write anything down during the Saturday meetings. Now, eventually they found out he was, eventually people noticed, but in the first few months, nobody noticed. But that particular clerk Frankfurter wrote in his instructions that clerk should say the Kaddish at his funeral, which is kind of interesting. Yeah, Gail.
I think of the phenomenon of how you feel that you can afford to be perhaps more rude or taken for granted from members of your family, or let's say as a Jew, for all the other Jews, that they will give you some latitude, but that you have to be on your very best behavior with everybody else.
That is a great analysis. Right. So that might have been part of his character. Yeah, I mean, one of the deep disappointments of Frankfurter, he lived next door and socialized frequently with, let me make sure I get the guy's name right. He was a major figure in the State Department who knew that the Holocaust was going on. And what was his name? Let's see. Let's see here. Let me find. What's his name? John McCloy, Assistant War Secretary John McCloy, who they were good friends. They dined together frequently. They lived next door to each other in Georgetown. John McCloy is the one who vetoed the idea, which was brought up, to bomb the train tracks to Auschwitz. He knew what was going on. Frankfurter never spoke with him about it, never lobbied him about it, never talked to Roosevelt about the Holocaust, as far as we know. Maybe he did, but there was this. Frankfurter would lobby for lots of other things. Frankfurter, at a certain point, Roosevelt got sick of Frankfurter. There's things where, Frankfurter was overzealous, but Roosevelt respected Frankfurter. But he never pushed him on Jewish issues. Neither did Stephen Wise, by the way, which was interesting. That is sort of another part of his enigma. Let me see. I want to just, more remarkable insofar as his Jewish legacy is concerned with his virtual silence on saving Jewish lives during World War II. Frankfurter's failure to intercede personally with Roosevelt to rescue his dear Uncle Solomon in Vienna is similarly perplexing. Troubling and seemingly inexplicable, finally, was his rude dismissal of Jan Karski after their 1943 meeting in Washington. Jan Karski was the person sent to Washington to tell the politicians what was happening. He was sent over by Polish Jewish communities, and his subsequent failure to discuss the horrific details of the final solution disclosed in Karski's report with the White House or with War Department officials. So here was a guy with he was a political insider of the highest order, no question, but he never pushed to rescue Jews. And that's a sad footnote. That doesn't detract from some of his great achievements, of course, but it does sort of symbolize a certain period in American history where, even the most successfully assimilated Jews kind of resisted expressing their Judaism. In fact, the only people to really put public pressure on the Roosevelt and during the Holocaust was the ultra-Zionist Irgun Party, who had I think his name was Henry Berg, I forget his exact name, but he led a major march in Washington in 1943 trying to bring attention to the Holocaust, and it fell like a lead balloon. He had certain people supporting him, but none of the established Jewish organizations supported him, sadly. Yeah, Gail?
Yes, you think that they were just a little bit removed from that first generation immigrant experience and didn't feel totally Jewish.
Yes.
And didn't feel totally secure and were unwilling to jeopardize their status here in America by supporting what was going on.
Well, yeah. And also, this was such a time of the Red Scare where, if you had any communist, so people were afraid of being tarred as unpatriotic. So I think, I always like to give people the benefit of the doubt.
You're
Probably-
generous, very generous.
Yeah, I
Ellen.
mean, I doubt he had any malicious, it's not like he didn't want to do something,
No,
but he
of
just
course
sort of
not.
felt, it's very hard, very hard. Yeah, Todd, and then we'll conclude.
Is there any evidence that he worked behind the scenes with anyone else to do things? Because again, major Jewish figures, certainly at that time and even later, did not want to be openly identified with Jewish causes because they thought, obviously, they wanted to assimilate as much as possible and not stand out.
No, there really isn't. There really isn't. The only really notable Jewish work he did was with Brandeis in the Zionist movement in the 1910s. That's it. That was his major Jewish involvement. Pretty much after that, after 1921, when they all left the movement because of Chaim Weizmann, he really has nothing to do with Jewish affairs. He brought in Jewish law clerks and things, and but he didn't really get involved in any Jewish activity. Maybe he did things behind the scenes. We never, I think that's sort of a part of the mystery. Maybe he did say something to Roosevelt. It's so hard to know for sure. But he wasn't, I don't think he ever visited Israel. He didn't, that aspect of it, of his life was not at all a big part of it. Yeah. So, well, thank you, everybody. Next week, we'll talk about Arthur Goldberg, who, had a lot of Chicago connections, including one of our former members. He's since passed away. Judge Milt Shader was a law partner of Arthur Goldberg. So we'll have a great, interesting discussion. See you next week.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.